Hello and welcome back into the quiet. If you're already lying down, good. Let your shoulders sink into the mattress a little further than they were a moment ago. Tonight, we're going to travel a long way from this room, and I'll be right here with you the whole way so there's nothing to hold on to and nothing to prepare. Just let your eyes rest and let your breathing slow and come with me. Here is the thing I want to tell you before anything else, because it's the reason we're here tonight, and I want to say it plainly rather than let it creep up on you. Roughly every 12,000 years, something seems to happen to the human story. Not a bad season, not a difficult decade, but something large enough to reach into the deep record of the earth itself, into the ice and the mud and the layers of old soil, and leave a mark there that lasts, a resetting. A moment when the world that people knew simply stops being the world, and the survivors, if there are survivors, have to begin again from very close to nothing. And here is the part I want you to hold gently without any fear in your chest, just as a fact sitting quietly on the table between us. It has been almost exactly that long since the last one. I'm not telling you that to unsettle you, I promise you that. If anything, I want the opposite. I want to lay this whole enormous question down so slowly and so carefully that by the time we reach the end of it, it feels less like a warning and more like a window. Because when you look at the full sweep of the human story, stretching back further than any single mind can really hold the small worries of your own evening, get very quiet very fast. And that, strange as it sounds, is exactly the kind of thing that makes for a peaceful night. So let me take you somewhere first, not to the whole vast sweep of it yet. Just to one evening in one small trading city on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea, a little more than 3,000 years ago. The city is called Ugarit, and if you've never heard the name, that's all right. Almost no one has, though, in its own time. It was one of the great crossroads of the ancient world. Picture a busy harbour town on the coast of what is now Syria, with ships coming and going from Egypt and Cyprus and the Aegean, warehouses full of grain and oil and bronze tools, and a royal palace where scribes sit cross-legged with soft wet tablets of clay, pressing the wedge-shaped marks of their writing into the surface with practised hands. One of those scribes whose name we will never know sits at his desk on what he believes is simply an ordinary difficult day. There has been trouble along the coast. Word has come that ships have been sighted, unfamiliar ones, moving with intent rather than trade. The king has already sent his own fleet elsewhere to help an ally who asked for it, and the harbour feels thinner than it should, more exposed than it has ever felt before. So the scribe writes a letter, the kind of urgent, practical letter people have written to each other for as long as there has been writing at all. He asks for help. He describes the ships on the horizon. He asks where the promised soldiers are. And then, for reasons we will never fully know, that letter was never sent. It was still sitting in the clay unbaked and unfinished when the city around it caught fire. We know all of this because archaeologists found that very tablet centuries later hardened permanently by the flames that destroyed the city that same night. The urgency of it fossilized into the clay itself, a message frozen in the exact moment its writer still believed there would be a tomorrow to send it in. He did not know, sitting there with his stylus in his hand, that he was living through the final hours of his entire world. Nobody in Ugarit that evening knew it. The bakers baking bread for the next day's market did not know it. The merchants counting out payment for a shipment of tin did not know it. As far as any of them understood, they were simply living an ordinary evening near the end of an extraordinary age, the same way you are living an ordinary evening right now. Certain the way every person in every age has always been certain that morning would come, and the world would still be exactly where they left it. It did not come not for them. Within a generation, the entire interconnected world, that city, belonged to the great kingdoms of the eastern Mediterranean. All of them bound together by trade routes and treaties and letters, just like that one, came apart. And that gently is where tonight's question really begins, because if a whole confident, sophisticated, deeply connected world could fall apart within a single scribe's lifetime and not one person living through the beginning of it understood what was happening, what would tell us now whether we are living through the quiet opening pages of something like it? Or whether that fear is simply the oldest trick our own minds like to play on us in the dark? That's the real question underneath everything we're going to walk through together tonight. Not whether the world is ending, because I can tell you honestly right now, at the very start, that this isn't where we're headed. It's something gentler and more interesting than that. It's the very old, very human habit of finding patterns in deep time, and the honest, careful work of figuring out which of those patterns are real, and which ones are simply the shape our own minds like to press onto a universe that was never really keeping score at all. Before we go any further into that, though, I want to ask you something small the way I always do if this is the kind of history that finds you here quiet and unhurried in the dark with nowhere else you need to be. It would mean a great deal if you took just a moment to leave a like on this video, and if you haven't already, to subscribe so these longer, slower journeys through deep time can keep finding their way to the people who need exactly this kind of company at exactly this kind of hour. And if you have a little energy left in you before your eyes get too heavy, tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight and what drew you into a story like this one. I read every single one of them, and there is something I find genuinely lovely about picturing all those different corners of the earth, all those different clocks, all of you lying somewhere in the quiet at the same time listening to the same slow voice. Now settle in properly, get comfortable, and let's begin. Because to really understand what happened to that scribe in Ugarit, and to understand the far older, far stranger Reset that came almost 10,000 years before him, we first need to understand what an ending like this actually looks like from the inside. Not the version we've been taught by films and disaster stories, all fire and single terrible nights, but the real one, the quieter and in many ways far more haunting version, the one written not in ash but in silence. And to see that clearly, we have to go back to the very beginning of what makes any civilization, including the one you're lying inside of tonight, work at all. Consider for a moment everything that has to be true for your own evening to have happened the way it did. Somewhere a farmer grew grain you never saw growing. Somewhere a truck driver you will never meet carried it along a road built by people whose names are already forgotten. Somewhere a shop clerk who has never spoken your name arranged it on a shelf, trusting without ever really thinking about it, that you would come and pay for it with a kind of paper or plastic that has no value at all except everyone quietly agrees it does. None of that is written down as a rule anywhere. It's simply believed all day every day by millions of strangers who have never met and never will. That web of unspoken trust, more than any wall or monument, is what a civilization actually is. And it is worth sitting with that for a moment because it means something quite strange follows from it. When a civilization dies, it isn't usually the buildings that go first, it's the web. This is the part historians and archaeologists have had to learn to see, because for a long time we were looking for the wrong kind of evidence entirely. We wanted our endings loud, we wanted a burned layer, a field of broken swords, a single dramatic year you could underline in a textbook. And sometimes, to be fair, there is exactly that. But far more often when researchers dig down through the layers of a place that once thrived and then didn't, what they find is not a wound but a silence. A language that was being carefully written down year after year, tax record after inventory after private letter, and then simply stops. No final dramatic entry, no last defiant word, just a gap sometimes lasting 2 or 3 centuries, sometimes longer than the entire history of a modern nation, before anyone in that place picks up writing again, if they ever do at all. That gap is one of the eeriest things in the whole archaeological record, because it means somebody was keeping the books, and then quietly, without any ceremony, Nobody was, and there was no one left nearby who even understood what had been lost. There is a difference, and it matters, between a civilization declining and a civilization collapsing. Decline is slow, and it is almost gentle by comparison. A kingdom loses a province here. A war there grows a little poorer, a little smaller, and life carries on inside it in a diminished but recognizable form. Rome in fact declined for the better part of 3 centuries, and for most of that long stretch, a person born inside the empire could still live something that looked and felt very much like a Roman life. Collapse is a different animal entirely. Collapse is what happens when the complexity itself comes undone, when a society doesn't merely shrink but forgets when the specialized skills that took generations to build simply have nowhere left to live, because the people who carried them scattered or starved or died with no one nearby who still needed to learn what they knew. And that gently is the strange truth sitting at the center of every collapse worth studying. The very things that make a civilization powerful are very often the same things that make it fragile. It sounds almost backward when you first hear it, because we tend to assume that more complexity simply means more strength. More people, more tools, more knowledge, more ways to solve whatever problem arrives at the door. And for a long while that is exactly true. But complexity carries a hidden cost, and the cost is dependency. Picture a city built on specialization the way every sophisticated society eventually is. One person grows the grain, another forges the tools, another keeps the accounts, another commands the soldiers, another prays on behalf of everyone else. Each one of them is remarkably good at their one narrow task, and each one of them in exchange for that skill has quietly given up the ability to do almost anything else. The blacksmith cannot grow his own food. The scribe cannot defend the city wall. It is in ordinary times the most productive arrangement our species has ever invented. It is the reason a person can spend an entire life doing one small expert thing and still somehow eat every single day, but pull out one thread near the bottom of that structure, the harvest or the trade route or the simple mutual trust that a king will honor his word, and everything stacked above it begins to lean and then to buckle. This is the piece I find genuinely moving once you sit with it long enough, because it means the strength and the fragility of a civilization were never really two separate things. They are the same feature of the same system seen from 2 different angles. Interdependence is the superpower. Interdependence is also the fault line. You cannot have the reach and the wonder of a deeply connected world without also carrying quietly everywhere within it the exact vulnerability that could someday unravel it. Now historians will tell you honestly that we do not fully agree on how much weight to put on this idea or on exactly which factor matters most in any single collapse, because the evidence for these ancient economies is frustratingly incomplete. We are reconstructing entire trading networks from a handful of surviving clay tablets, a scatter of shipwrecks, the occasional royal letter that happened to survive fire and time and looting. Scholars still argue, sometimes quite sharply, over how centralized these Bronze Age economies really were, and how much ordinary people even felt the strain before everything gave way. That uncertainty is worth naming plainly, because it would be dishonest to pretend the ancient record hands us a tidy, complete picture. It hands us fragments, and careful, patient people spend entire careers trying to fit those fragments together without forcing them into a shape they don't actually have. But here is a detail that tends to surprise people, and it's one worth carrying with you, because it makes the whole abstract idea of fragility suddenly very concrete. The entire military and economic backbone of that glittering Bronze Age world, the swords, the plows, the armor, the tools that built and defended everything, depended on a single alloy: bronze. And bronze is not something you simply dig out of the ground the way you might find iron ore nearby. Bronze is a recipe, copper mixed carefully with tin. And while copper could be found in a number of places around the Mediterranean, tin was rare. genuinely rare, and it had to travel enormous distances along fragile exposed trade routes, some of it very likely originating from mines as far away as what is now Britain or Central Asia, which means that the most advanced civilization the world had yet produced had built its entire material foundation on a single scarce ingredient that nobody within 1,000 miles could simply grow or mine locally or do without. Cut that supply line even briefly and you cannot make a sword or a plough or a nail. Their greatest strength and their single most dangerous weakness ran along exactly the same thread. It is a strange thing to lie in the dark and think about, but it is not really so different from the world you are resting inside right now. We do not depend on tin anymore, but we depend in ways most of us have simply stopped noticing on things equally specific and equally distant. A handful of factories on the other side of the planet that manufacture one particular kind of computer chip nearly everyone else's machines quietly rely on. A narrow shipping lane that a significant share of the world's goods must pass through, so narrow that a single vessel turned the wrong way at the wrong moment can hold up commerce for the entire globe. We tend to imagine our own age as something entirely apart from the ancient world, too advanced, too clever, too well distributed to ever share a weakness with a kingdom that wrote its letters in wet clay. But the shape of the vulnerability is oddly familiar once you know where to look for it, and it was into a world built on exactly that kind of narrow invisible thread that trouble began to arrive. Not as a single dramatic blow, but as several quiet pressures, arriving one after another, each one landing on a place already a little more strained than the one before it. What began gently and almost unnoticed as a run of difficult harvests along the eastern edge of the Mediterranean was about to become something else entirely. The trouble did not arrive as an army. That's the part worth sitting with first, because it runs against almost everything we've been trained to expect from an ending this large. There was no single morning when a horn sounded and the old world simply stopped. What arrived instead was weather, and weather is a slow, patient, almost gentle kind of catastrophe, the sort that can go on for years before anyone quite admits what they're living through. Climate scientists working with pollen records and lake sediments from the region now believe the eastern Mediterranean entered a long, punishing dry spell sometime in the 13th century before Christ, a drought that may have stretched in some reconstructions well over a century, and by some estimates considerably longer than that. Not a difficult summer, not even a difficult decade. A dry spell long enough that a person could be born into it, grow old inside it, and die never having known the rains their grandparents used to describe. Grain yields fell, storehouses that had once carried a kingdom through a bad year began carrying it through a bad generation instead, and then simply couldn't anymore. And famine, once it settles into a region, this thoroughly does something quieter and more corrosive than starvation alone. It moves people. Hungry populations do not stay where they are and wait politely for conditions to improve. They walk in search of anywhere that still has food, and a mass of desperate displaced people arriving at someone else's border is its own kind of pressure entirely separate from the hunger that set them walking in the first place. Then, as though the drought alone were not enough, the ground itself grew restless. Archaeologists' working sites up and down the eastern Mediterranean coast, from Mycenaean palaces in Greece to Hittite strongholds in Anatolia, have found something that some researchers have come to call an earthquake storm, a striking cluster of major seismic events across the same general decades, toppling walls and fracturing palace foundations in one settlement after another. It's worth being honest here, because the evidence for this earthquake storm is genuinely debated among specialists. Dating a single earthquake precisely enough to place it within a few decades, 3,000 years later, is extraordinarily difficult, and some scholars argue the pattern is real, while others suspect we may simply be noticing destruction layers that would have looked clustered no matter their true spacing. But even setting that argument aside, the physical damage at multiple sites is not in question, and one plunging blow lands very differently on a kingdom already weakened by the hunger than it would on one at full strength. A single earthquake on its own rarely ends a civilization. People rebuild the way people have always rebuilt, but an earthquake arriving on top of a famine in a region already stretched thinner than it had ever been is a different kind of injury entirely. And underneath both of those pressures, the invisible web we spoke of earlier had already begun to fray. This was, remember, a world stitched together by long, fragile trade routes, and as fields failed and cities grew unstable, ships simply stopped making the journeys they had always made. Here is where the true cruelty of interdependence reveals itself, because these kingdoms did not fall one at a time, each in its own private isolation. They fell together, precisely because they had spent centuries leaning on one another. There survive remarkably actual letters from this period, kings writing to kings in the shared diplomatic language of the age, and one especially haunting example comes from a Hittite king pleading with Egypt for emergency grain shipments, describing a famine so severe that it threatened the stability of his entire kingdom. Egypt, struggling with its own harvests, could offer only limited help. When one great power faltered, it did not fail quietly and alone. It pulled at every other power still standing, because the very connections that had made this world so rich now carried the collapse forward like a current running down a wire. Into that widening instability came the group history remembers a little unfairly as the sole villains of the story. The Egyptian records of this period, inscribed by the pharaohs Merneptah, and later more famously Ramesses III, describe waves of raiders and migrants arriving by sea, a loose coalition of peoples. The inscriptions never fully name or explain whom historians today simply call the Sea Peoples. For much of the 20th century, they were cast as the single cause of the whole collapse, a tidy villain for a complicated story. But look at them alongside everything else happening at the same moment and a more complicated picture starts to form. Many scholars now believe the Sea Peoples were at least in part themselves refugees, people displaced by the very droughts and failing harvests unsettling everyone else in the region, moving not out of conquest but out of the same desperate calculation that has driven human migration in every age, that staying meant starving and moving at least offered a chance. It is worth saying plainly that this remains an active area of research, and archaeologists still disagree about where these groups originated, how organized they truly were, and how much destruction can honestly be laid at their feet versus attributed to the internal collapse already underway before they ever arrived. What seems most likely, and what most current scholarship leans toward, is that they were both a symptom of the crisis and, once in motion, an accelerant of it, a wandering, uprooted population that added new strain to societies that had none left to give. One of the clearest, most human traces of exactly how this felt from the inside comes from the city we spent time in earlier. The trading port of Ugarit. Beyond that single unfinished letter left hardening in the flames, archaeologists have recovered a small set of related correspondence from the city's final days, including a message from the king of Ugarit to the ruler of Cyprus, warning that enemy ships had already been sighted along the coast and that the kingdom's own fleet and much of its army were away elsewhere, having been sent to help defend an ally against the exact kind of threat now bearing down on Ugarit itself. It is an almost unbearably ordinary piece of writing, the kind of practical, slightly anxious correspondence any government official might send, and that ordinariness is precisely what makes it so affecting. Whoever wrote it was managing a crisis the way any competent person would, gathering information, requesting help, trying to buy time, with absolutely no sense that this particular crisis would be the one that ended everything. Ugarit burned not long afterward and was never meaningfully rebuilt. Its extensive royal archive, thousands of clay tablets recording trade law, religion, and daily administration. It survives today only because the fire that destroyed the city baked that soft clay permanently hard, preserving quite by accident the last living voice of a world about to disappear. Across the sea in Greece, the ending took an even stranger and, to my mind, more poignant shape. The great Mycenaean palaces, the world, Homer would later half remember in his poems of heroes and citadels, were abandoned within this same general window of decades, their populations scattering into smaller, poorer, more scattered settlements. And with the palaces went something almost impossible to picture, disappearing entirely: the ability to write. The Mycenaeans had used a script called Linear B to keep their palace records an intricate system tied closely to the bureaucratic life of the palace itself. When the palaces fell, the scribes who maintained that system had nowhere left to practice their craft and no children left who needed to learn it. Writing did not merely decline in Greece. It vanished completely for several centuries, an entire population living, working, and raising families without a single person among them able to set a word down on any surface at all. When writing eventually returned to Greece generations later, it came back as something new, entirely an alphabet borrowed and reshaped from contact with other Mediterranean peoples, utterly unrelated to the script their own ancestors had used. A civilization had not merely lost an empire, it had quite literally forgotten how to read. That more than any burned palace or broken city wall is the detail scholars keep returning to, because it captures something the ash and rubble alone cannot. This was not simply several kingdoms falling within the same rough span of decades by unhappy coincidence. It was one interconnected system bound together by trade, diplomacy, and mutual dependence, coming apart as a single sprawling event. The fragility hiding inside all that magnificent complexity, finally revealing itself all at once, across an entire region in the span of a single difficult lifetime. And it leaves behind a question worth carrying quietly forward, because the Bronze Age world, for all its devastation, was still a relatively contained collapse, a network of kingdom unravelling while the rivers kept flowing and the seasons kept arriving exactly where they were expected. There is a far older, far stranger reset waiting further back in the story, one that did not merely topple a handful of kingdoms bound together by trade, but reached into the climate of the entire planet itself, and reshaped what kind of world was even possible to live in at all. Picture for a moment an entirely different kind of world, one so far back in time that nothing we would recognize as history has happened yet. No writing anywhere on Earth. No cities, no kings, no letters, baked hard in the fire of a burning palace. Just small bands of people scattered across every continent, following herds, reading the sky, watching a long, brutal ice age finally begin to loosen its grip after tens of thousands of years. This is the world we need to visit now, because it holds a reset so much larger than anything that happened to the Bronze Age, that the fall of those glittering kingdoms starts to look by comparison like a single hard winter. About 14,000 years ago, the planet was warming. Slowly, the way climate is supposed to move in careful increments spread across centuries. The great ice sheets that had buried what is now Canada and much of northern Europe under walls of ice more than a mile thick were finally retreating. Forests were creeping back into land that had known only frozen tundra for longer than any memory could hold. Herds of enormous animals grazed across newly green plains, and the small groups of hunters who followed them had every reason to believe the world was simply gradually becoming kinder. If they imagined a future for their children at all, it likely looked like more of exactly that. More warmth, more game, an easier life than the one they had inherited. And then roughly 12,900 years ago, the warming did something climate is not supposed to do at all. It stopped and then it reversed and the world fell back into the ice. Scientists call this event into the Younger Dryas, named with a strange gentleness after a small Arctic wildflower, called Dryas octopetala, whose pollen shows up abruptly in the sediment from this era, blooming in places that had only just begun growing forests again. It is a soft, almost pretty name for what may be one of the most violent climate reversals ever recorded in the deep history of this planet. Researchers drilling ice cores in Greenland, reading the layered snowfall of each passing year, the way you might read the rings inside a very old tree, have found something that still unsettles specialists who study it closely. In some of these readings, the climate over Greenland appears to have shifted from something close to mild conditions towards something close to full glacial cold in a span as short as 3 years. Not 3 centuries. 3 years. A single early childhood. A person could hold clear memories of a warmer, gentler world from their own earliest years, and grow into adulthood, standing in a landscape that had become almost entirely unrecognizable. It's worth pausing on how strange that actually is, because it runs against nearly everything we instinctively believe about how climate behaves. We tend to think of it as the slowest force there is, moving over the span of 1,000 generations, far too gradual for any single life to notice. And most of the time that instinct is correct. But the ice cores are telling researchers that climate apparently has another setting hidden inside it, one where instead of drifting it can genuinely snap, tipping from one stable state into another far faster than anyone living through it could possibly explain or prepare for. There would have been no understanding available to the people caught inside that shift. Only the unmistakable fact that the cold had returned and this time it was staying. The leading explanation scientists point to today involves the ocean, and specifically a great deep current running through the North Atlantic that behaves something like a conveyor belt. Warm water flowing north near the surface before cooling, sinking and circulating back south in the deep ocean. That circulation is a large part of what keeps the Northern Hemisphere as mild as it is. As the melting ice sheets released enormous volumes of cold fresh water into the North Atlantic, that circulation may have slowed dramatically or stalled altogether, cutting off the warmth that had been flowing north and letting the ice come rushing back in behind it. It remains even now the most widely supported explanation among climate scientists, though. Researchers continue actively debating the precise mechanics of exactly how quickly that stall could have occurred and how it interacted with other factors happening at the same time. Whatever set it in motion, the consequences across North America were extraordinary, and in some ways they are the part of this story that lingers longest once you've heard it. The largest, most magnificent animals the continent had ever supported simply disappear from the fossil record within this narrow window. Mammoths with their long curling tusks. Giant ground sloths, some standing taller than a grown adult, capable of pulling down branches high in the trees. Dire wolves. Short-faced bears so large that standing upright they would have towered over any person unlucky enough to encounter one. Camels and native horses that had lived across the Americas for many thousands of years, one after another gone. It stands today as one of the great extinction events of the relatively recent past, and it clusters with striking precision right around the beginning of the Younger Dryas. Alongside the animals, an entire human way of life disappears as well, though, not as far as we can tell the people themselves. Across North America, archaeologists have identified a widespread and highly successful culture we call Clovis, named for the town in New Mexico, where their distinctive, beautifully crafted, fluted stone spear points were first properly documented in the 1930s. For centuries before this event, those points turn up at sites from coast to coast, the unmistakable signature of a mobile, capable people who hunted the very giants that were about to vanish. And then right at the onset of this abrupt cold, the distinctive Clovis point simply stops appearing in the archaeological record. The people did not vanish. Their descendants almost certainly continued on in different forms, adapting to a transformed landscape. But that particular recognizable way of life, tied so closely to a world that had just been erased, comes to an end at precisely this threshold. And there is a genuinely surprising detail here, one that even many people who know general history reasonably well have never encountered. At more than 50 separate sites scattered across North America, geologists have identified a thin, unusually dark layer of soil, rich in organic material, laid down right at the very start of this cold reversal. Researchers who study it have come to call it somewhat plainly the black mat, and what makes it remarkable is how consistently it behaves from one site to another, almost like a line someone had deliberately drawn across the landscape. Dig down beneath that dark layer into the older ground below it, and you find Clovis tools. You find the bones of mammoths and the other vanished giants. Dig above it into the newer soil, and you find neither. The tools and the great beasts occur below that thin, dark stripe of earth, and they do not occur above it. Scholars still debate exactly what the black mat represents and precisely what combination of forces produced it, whether it reflects the sudden cold itself, the collapse of the plant life. The giants depended on hunting pressure arriving at the worst possible moment, or some tangled combination of all three arriving together. That argument remains genuinely unresolved among specialists, but the line itself, the physical layer in the earth separating one world from the one that replaced it, is not in dispute at all. It's sitting there in the ground right now, waiting for anyone with a shovel and enough patience to find it. For more than 1,000 years, the cold held its grip on the northern world, and then with almost exactly the same startling speed with which it had arrived, it released. Around 11,700 years ago, the ice cores show Greenland warming by as much as 10 degrees Celsius within a matter of decades, not millennia. The ocean's great circulation apparently restarted. The deep cold finally loosened its hold, and this time remarkably the warmth held settling into the long, stable, generous climate that geologists now call the Holocene, the very age you have lived your entire life. Inside, without ever once having to think about it, every field of cultivated grain, every ancient city, every pharaoh and empire and quiet, ordinary evening in human history, since all of it fits inside the calm that followed this one reset, which leaves us with the small piece of simple arithmetic worth turning over gently in your mind before we go any further. That reset, the one that ended 1,000-year winter and opened the door to everything we now call civilization, happened roughly 12,000 years ago. And there is something waiting on the far side of that reset that very few people expect, something that would completely rewrite what anyone assumed the survivors of a catastrophe like this were even capable of building. For a very long time, historians told the story of civilization as though it were a ladder, with each rung resting firmly on the one below it. First came farming, they said, because you needed a reliable surplus of food before anything else was possible. Then came permanent villages, because farmers need to stay near their fields. Then came surplus and leisure, and only once people were fed and settled and comfortable did anyone have the time or the reason to build something sacred, a temple, a shrine, a monument, to whatever they believed watched over them. It was a tidy story, and it made a certain intuitive sense, and for the better part of a century almost nobody seriously questioned it. Then on a quiet limestone hill in southeastern Turkey, that entire ladder was kicked out from under everyone all at once. The hill is called Göbekli Tepe, which translates roughly to Potbelly Hill, and for decades it drew almost no attention at all. An earlier archaeological survey in the 1960s had walked right across it, noted some scattered broken stones and a single lonely tree growing near the summit, and concluded it was probably nothing more than an abandoned medieval cemetery, unremarkable enough to leave alone. It might have stayed exactly that in the record forever, if a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt hadn't come to look at it again in 1994 with a different set of instincts. Walking the hill, he noticed the tops of buried stones poking up through the soil, and something about their shape struck him as wrong for gravestones. He returned the following year and began to dig, and what came up out of that hillside quietly rewrote the timeline of the entire human story. Beneath the surface lay a series of large stone enclosures, rings of massive limestone pillars standing upright, some of them more than 5 meters tall and weighing many tons apiece. These were not rough, unshaped boulders. They had been deliberately carved into elegant T-shaped forms, arranged carefully in circles, with a pair of especially large pillars standing at the center of each ring like sentinels. And across the surface of many of these stones in careful relief carving is an entire menagerie of the ancient world. Foxes caught mid-leap, wild boars, snakes rendered as long rippling lines pouring down the stone, scorpions, vultures with their wings spread wide, a bird closely associated in many later cultures with death and the passage of the soul. Whoever carved these had a genuine artistic vision and hands skilled enough to press that vision permanently into solid rock using nothing but flint tools. Here is the detail that stopped researchers cold when the dates came back. The oldest of these enclosures appear to date to somewhere around 11,600 years ago, which places their construction remarkably close to the very end of that long, harsh, cold period we just walked through together, right as the ice was finally releasing its grip and the warm, stable climate of our own age was beginning. And the people who built this were not farmers. They had no pottery, no metal tools of any kind, no writing to plan the work, and as far as the evidence shows, no domesticated animals to help haul stones that in some cases weighed as much as a small truck. By every measure historians had previously used to define the term, these were simply hunter-gatherers, moving seasonally, living off wild game and wild plants. And yet they quarried multi-ton pillars from the surrounding limestone, transported them, stood them upright in carefully arranged rings, decorated them with sophisticated art, and did this not once but repeatedly across many generations on the same hill. It's worth sitting with what that actually means, because it turns the old ladder completely upside down. Klaus Schmidt himself came to believe something genuinely radical, that perhaps the gathering came first, that the deepest human impulse was never simply to plant a field and wait for it to grow, but to come together in large numbers at a place that felt significant, to build something larger than any single person could build alone, and to stand inside it together in something like awe. And if that's true, then farming itself may not have been the cause of settled life and sacred building. It may have been a consequence of it. Feeding a large crowd of people who have gathered to haul and carve stone for weeks or months at a time creates enormous sustained pressure to find a more reliable food source than hunting alone can guarantee. There is a real possibility, one that a number of archaeologists now take seriously, that the effort required to keep the builders of Göbekli Tepe fed was among the very pressures that first pushed people toward deliberately cultivating wild grain, rather than the other way around. I want to be careful here, though, because not every archaeologist reads this site exactly the way Schmidt originally proposed it, and it would be a disservice to the evidence to pretend the matter is fully settled. More recent excavation has turned up some evidence that at least a small number of people may have lived at or very near the site for extended periods, which complicates the idea of it as a purely ceremonial gathering place with no permanent residents at all. The precise relationship between the monument, the surrounding settlements, and the earliest experiments with agriculture in this region is still being worked out carefully, one excavation season at a time, and researchers continue to debate the details. But the core discovery, the fact that people without farming, without metal, without writing, without any of the things earlier generations of historians assumed were prerequisites for monumental architecture, built something this ambitious and this beautiful, is not in dispute. Göbekli Tepe predates Stonehenge by roughly 6,000 years. It predates the pyramids of Egypt by something closer to 7,000. When these pillars were first raised, there was no such thing as a city anywhere on the face of the earth. And then generations later, something happened at Göbekli Tepe that I find honestly more moving than almost anything else in this entire story. The people who used this site did not simply abandon it to the wind and let it erode slowly into the hillside the way most ruins do. They buried it, deliberately by hand, over what appears to have been a considerable stretch of time. They filled the enclosures with rubble-packed earth and animal bone, until the great carved pillars were completely hidden beneath the surface of the hill they had built them on. Nobody knows for certain why. It may have been a closing ritual, a formal way of putting something to rest once its purpose had been fulfilled. It may have been something else entirely that we simply don't have the cultural context to understand. But that act of burial, whatever its meaning is, the reason the site survived at all, intact and largely undisturbed for more than 11,000 years, waiting for a man with a trowel to brush the soil away from a carved vulture's wing and see it nearly exactly as its makers had left it. Think for a moment about who these builders actually were. They or their parents or their grandparents had very likely lived through the tail end of that 1,000-year winter we just spent time inside. They had watched the great animals disappear. They'd survived a genuine planetary reset, the kind that leaves a black line in the earth, separating one world from the next. And what did they do coming out the other side of it? They did not simply scrape by and endure in silence. They gathered. They carved. They raised the heaviest, most deliberate, most meaningful structures they were capable of imagining using nothing but stone and bone tools and an enormous amount of collective will, and they stood inside those structures together. It is in its own quiet way one of the most hopeful discoveries in the whole of archaeology, because it suggests that even at the very bottom of one of the deepest resets the human story has ever recorded, someone somewhere was already picking up a stone and beginning to build. That pairing and ending and a beginning arriving almost in the same breath turns out to be a shape that repeats itself again and again the further back through deep time you're willing to look. And it raises a question worth carrying gently with you as we go further, because if a reset roughly 12,000 years ago gave rise to something as astonishing as this hill in Anatolia, and a much smaller unravelling, some 3,000 years ago gave rise eventually to the alphabet and the world that followed it. A person lying quietly in the dark tonight might reasonably start to wonder whether these dates are simply scattered coincidences, or whether there's something more deliberate humming underneath all of them, some kind of rhythm in the sky or the earth itself that keeps bringing the hammer down and lifting it again on something like a schedule. That question about a rhythm hiding somewhere in the sky or the earth is not a new one, and it's not something dreamed up by people looking for something to be afraid of late at night. It has occupied a small, persistent group of serious scientists for decades, and to understand why you first need to understand something you have almost certainly seen with your own eyes, without ever thinking of it as part of a much larger pattern. On a clear night far enough from city lights, if you lie back and let your eyes adjust for a while, sooner or later, a thin streak of light will draw itself across the sky and vanish before you can properly point at it. A shooting star. It feels random, almost like a small private gift from an indifferent universe. But it isn't random at all. It's on a schedule, and once you understand that schedule, the night sky starts to look a little less like a decoration and a little more like the face of an old, patient clock. Comets, as they loop around the sun, shed a long trail of dust and gravel behind them, scattered out along their orbital path. The Earth, moving through space on its own path, sometimes crosses through one of these debris trails, and when it does, we plough into all that scattered material at extraordinary speed, and the tiny grains burn up in the atmosphere, and we call it a meteor shower. That's why the reliable showers arrive at almost exactly the same time every year. the Perseids in August, the Geminids in December. We are not stumbling into them by chance, we are in a very real sense, keeping an appointment the Earth has kept every single year for a very long time. Most of these debris streams are thin, faint, pretty, and largely uneventful. But there is one that behaves quite differently from all the others, and the whole strange idea we're about to walk through together turns entirely on it. It's called the torrid stream, named for the direction in the sky the meteors appear to fall from, and unlike the narrow ribbons that produce most annual showers, it is enormous, spread out so widely that the Earth doesn't cross it once a year, the way it does with most streams. It crosses it twice, once in late October around the time of Halloween, which is why some of its more dramatic fireballs have earned the nickname Halloween fireballs, and again during the summer in daylight when the display is largely invisible to us. Twice every year, without fail, the Earth passes directly through this enormous drifting field of ancient debris. For a long time, the accepted explanation was straightforward. A modest, well-studied comet called Encke, on a short, tight orbit, was assumed to be the source of the material steadily shedding dust as it circled the Sun. But there is a problem with that explanation that has nagged at astronomers for decades, and it's a problem of simple scale. Encke is a relatively small comet, and the torrid stream is anything but small. There is simply far more material scattered across far more space than one modest comet seems capable of having produced on its own, even accounting for a very long history of orbiting the Sun. Something considerably larger appears to be missing from the picture. In 1984, two astronomers, Victor Klube and Bill Napier, proposed an idea to explain that missing mass, an idea that remains to this day seriously contested among specialists. What if Encke and the torrid stream and a scattering of other smaller objects sharing similar orbits are not separate bodies at all, but fragments of one single much larger comet, a genuine giant perhaps 60 to 100 kilometers across, that arrived from the outer solar system tens of thousands of years ago, was captured into an orbit closer to the Sun, and then sometime within roughly the last 10 to 20,000 years began breaking apart into the smaller fragments and vast debris cloud we still cross paths with twice a year today. Klube and Napier gave the idea a name: coherent catastrophism, built on the notion that impacts from space might not be scattered randomly and rarely through time the way most 20th century astronomers assumed, but might instead arrive in denser clusters, moments when the Earth happens to pass through an especially thick debris-rich section of this ancient broken comet's orbit. It's worth pausing on the timing they proposed because it's the detail that tends to make people go quiet when they hear it. 10 to 20,000 years ago is not deep geological time, the kind measured in millions of years that feels comfortably abstract and distant. It sits squarely within the span of human memory, overlapping precisely with the world we just spent time inside the long cold reversal of the Younger, Dryas, the vanishing of the great Ice Age animals, the earliest hunters who would eventually raise the pillars at Göbekli Tepe. If Klube and Napier are right, then at the very moment our distant ancestors were living through the end of that older world, the sky above them may have been quietly filling with the scattered wreckage of a dying giant comet. I have to be honest with you here the way this kind of story deserves, because this is exactly the point where the evidence gets genuinely difficult and genuinely contested. Coherent catastrophism has never been accepted as mainstream astronomy, and in the years since Klube and Napier first proposed it, several careful modern surveys using increasingly capable telescopes have gone looking specifically within the torrid stream for the large, dangerous fragments the theory predicts should still be hiding there. What those searches have generally found is considerably quieter than the boldest version of the theory suggested. The population of genuinely large hazardous objects within the stream appears to be smaller than early proponents feared. Though the search is far from complete and some intriguingly large objects have been identified in recent years, that keep the question from being fully closed. The stream itself is entirely real. The twice-yearly crossing is entirely real, and anyone with a clear sky and a little patience can watch it happen. But the specific claim that it conceals a hidden population of civilization-scale hazards on some semi-predictable schedule remains honestly an open and actively argued question rather than an established fact. There is one further thread to this that shows just how alive the debate still is even now. Some researchers who take the Taurid hypothesis seriously have pointed to the extraordinary event over Siberia in 1908, when something exploded in the air above the remote Tunguska region with a force comparable to a large hydrogen bomb flattening more than 2,000 square kilometers of forest without leaving behind any confirmed impact crater. They've noted that the event occurred in late June during the exact stretch of the calendar when the Earth crosses the daylight portion of the Taurid stream, and they've wondered aloud whether Tunguska might have been a fragment of that same ancient broken comet, arriving precisely on schedule. It's a genuinely intriguing coincidence to sit with. It is also by the honest consensus of most researchers who study it entirely unproven, and plenty of specialists consider the timing simply that a coincidence with the object itself, most likely an ordinary stony asteroid unrelated to the Taurid debris at all. So where does that leave the idea of a clock hidden somewhere in the sky, neither fully vindicated nor fully dismissed, which is, if you think about it honestly, exactly what an unresolved scientific question is supposed to look like from the inside? What is completely certain sitting quietly underneath all of that argument is something you can go outside and witness for yourself without needing to take anyone's word for it at all. Twice a year, without exception, this planet sails directly through the scattered wreckage of something that broke apart long before any human being ever learned to plant a field or fire a piece of clay. That much isn't speculation. That part is simply true hanging over your head right now while you rest. But a scattering of dust burning harmlessly, 60 miles overhead, is one thing gentle enough that people make wishes on it. The far more serious question, the one that pulls this whole thread back down to solid ground, is what happens when the debris crossing our path isn't the size of a grain of sand at all, but something considerably larger. And whether there is any real evidence that something exactly like that already happened once before, at the worst possible moment in the whole story we've been walking through tonight. There is a hypothesis seriously published and seriously contested in roughly equal measure that says we don't have to imagine what happens when something larger than a grain of sand comes through, because it may have already happened once at precisely the moment the last great winter began, and that the evidence for it has been sitting quietly in the ground the whole time, waiting for someone to notice what they were standing on. For most of the time, researchers have studied the beginning of the Younger Dryas. The explanation has centered entirely on water, that great pulse of cold melt water pouring into the North Atlantic and stalling the ocean circulation that keeps the northern hemisphere mild. It remains even now the explanation most climate scientists find best supported by the evidence. But in 2007, a team led by a physicist named Richard Firestone published a paper in a well-respected scientific journal proposing something considerably more dramatic. They argued the trigger wasn't water at all, it was fire. Specifically, they proposed that around 12,800 years ago, a comet, or more likely a swarm of fragments from a larger body, struck the Earth, or more precisely detonated in the atmosphere above North America, an airburst rather than a direct impact, releasing a wall of heat and shockwave that swept across the continent, and that this single catastrophic event, not a slow ocean stall but one violent afternoon, was what ignited widespread fires, killed off the great Ice Age animals, ended the Clovis way of life, and knocked the entire climate backward into 1,000 years of cold. That is an enormous claim, and enormous claims require correspondingly enormous evidence, so it's worth walking through exactly what the researchers say they found, because the specificity of it is precisely what has kept this argument alive and unresolved for nearly 2 decades now. They pointed first to an unusual spike in platinum found in Greenland ice cores dated to right around this period. Platinum being a metal that is rare in the Earth's crust generally, but considerably more common in certain types of space rock. They pointed to the presence of nanodiamonds, microscopic diamond structures that can form under the extreme heat and pressure associated with a violent impact found scattered through sediment layers dated to the same narrow window. They pointed to tiny magnetic microspheral small droplets of once molten material, the kind of thing you might expect to find if the ground itself had been briefly flash heated by an enormous release of energy. And they pointed to elevated soot and carbon within that same dark layer of Earth we spoke of earlier, the black matte evidence, they argued, of a continent that had briefly and violently burned. Laid out together like that, it can sound remarkably compelling. Platinum that may have arrived from space. Diamonds formed in an instant of extraordinary heat. Droplets of once molten rock. Soot from continental fires. All of it clustered within the same thin band of ancient soil, all dated to roughly the same narrow moment in time. And here is exactly where I need to be as honest with you as I have tried to be all night, because if you only heard that list of evidence, you would reasonably conclude the case was essentially closed. It is not. If you ask most working geologists and archaeologists studying this period today, a considerable majority will tell you the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis remains not just unproven but has been substantially challenged by follow-up research in nearly every major line of evidence originally proposed. The scientific pushback arrived in careful methodical waves, and it's genuinely worth understanding because watching a contested idea get tested this thoroughly is watching scientific inquiry do exactly what it's supposed to do. Other research teams travelled to the same sites and to entirely new ones, attempting to replicate the original findings, and frequently could not. The nanodiamonds proved especially difficult to confirm consistently. Some teams reported finding them. Other teams, examining some of the very same samples, concluded that what had been identified as nanodiamonds was likely something more mundane, a case of misidentification under the microscope. The magnetic microspherals turned out to have several entirely ordinary explanations as well, since similar particles can form from wildfires, from volcanic activity, and even from industrial contamination introduced long after the fact with no connection whatsoever to anything falling from space. The dating itself came under serious scrutiny too, with critics arguing that evidence gathered from dozens of scattered sites across an entire continent doesn't actually align tightly enough on a single narrow moment to support the idea of one instantaneous global event, and that once you account honestly for the margins of error involved, the apparent precision starts to blur considerably. And underneath all of it sits perhaps the hardest question of all, one that still has no fully satisfying answer either way. An impact large enough to trigger a hemisphere-wide climate reversal ought, by most conventional thinking, to leave some kind of identifiable crater somewhere on the Earth's surface, and to this day no undisputed crater of the right size and the right age has ever been found. The airburst version of the hypothesis sidesteps that problem neatly, since an atmospheric explosion wouldn't necessarily leave a crater at all, but a hypothesis that explains away its own missing evidence understandably makes many scientists uneasy, and its critics have not let that particular gap go unmentioned. And yet, in fairness to the researchers who continue pursuing this idea, it would be inaccurate to describe it as a dead theory quietly fading from the scientific literature. It genuinely has not gone away. New supporting papers continue to appear with some regularity, even now. A fresh platinum anomaly identified at a previously unstudied site. A newly reported layer of what researchers describe as impact-related glass, a scorched sediment layer found at the bottom of an ancient lake bed somewhere else entirely. The scientists who support this hypothesis have not conceded the argument, and at least some of what they continue to bring forward is not easily dismissed out of hand. So the debate genuinely continues actively in academic journals, at scientific conferences, between researchers who respect each other's work and still profoundly disagree about what it means. One side maintains the underlying pattern is real, and that mainstream geology has simply been too slow and too skeptical to properly reckon with it. The other side maintains that a small persistent group of researchers is seeing a pattern they went looking for from the very beginning, and that enthusiasm has occasionally outpaced the actual rigor of the evidence. Most of the wider scientific community sits somewhere in between, watching closely, largely unconvinced by the strongest version of the claim, but not entirely willing to dismiss the question either. It would be easy, hearing all of that laid out together, to land on one of two simple conclusions: either that the impact obviously happened and mainstream science is simply too stubborn to admit it, or that the whole idea is nonsense, unworthy of further attention. Neither of those conclusions is really where an honest reading of the evidence leaves you. This is simply what a genuinely unresolved scientific question looks like from the inside before it has been settled one way or the other, and some questions in this field of study take considerably longer than a human lifetime to fully resolve. A fringe hypothesis that refuses to quietly disappear is not the same thing as a proven one. That distinction matters, and it weighs fairly against the impact camp. But a hypothesis that keeps generating new testable evidence, that keeps sending its own critics back out into the field to check the ground again, is not nothing either. It is, in its own slow and occasionally contentious way, precisely how science is meant to work. And this is exactly where the weight of the question becomes clear, because you can feel what's actually at stake underneath all this careful academic disagreement. If the last great reset really did arrive as fire falling from the sky, rather than as a slow gradual stalling of ocean currents, then that idea of a clock hidden somewhere in the sky, the ancient broken comet, the twice-yearly crossing through its scattered debris, suddenly carries a great deal more weight than a pretty coincidence. It would mean the debris field overhead and the ending of an entire age on the ground below it were never two separate stories at all, but one continuous event, cause and consequence joined together across a single catastrophic season. Notice, though, exactly how much weight that one small word "if" is being asked to carry here. It's holding up an entire architecture of consequence on a foundation that responsible scientists still cannot fully agree is solid ground. Which is honestly the most truthful place this particular thread can leave us tonight. Not a tidy answer, but a kind of patience. We are attempting to read an event nearly 13,000 years old from the thinnest possible traces, a scatter of unusual metal locked in old ice, a scattering of possible diamonds barely visible under magnification, a dark stripe of ancient soil running quietly beneath the ground of an entire continent. And thoughtful, careful people, looking at exactly the same evidence, continue to disagree in good faith about what it's actually trying to tell us. There's no real shame in that kind of uncertainty. It might even be one of the more honest and human things science does, sifting patiently through faint traces long after the original event has gone completely silent, and admitting without embarrassment that we are simply not certain yet. Which brings us gently to the parts of this story that are not contested at all, the rhythms in the earth and the sun that scientists have actually managed to measure with real confidence, proven the way the ordinary rise and fall of the tides is proven. And the strange thing, once you go looking closely at those confirmed rhythms for the tidy 12,000-year bell. This whole night has been circling around is what you find waiting there instead. There is something almost reassuring in admitting plainly that a question doesn't yet have a clean answer, and it's worth carrying that same honesty into the ground that actually is solid, because there is quite a lot of it, and it deserves just as much care as the contested claims we've just walked through together. Start with the oldest and most thoroughly proven rhythm we know of, one that has nothing to do with comets or debris streams at all. In the early decades of the 20th century, a Serbian mathematician and engineer named Milutin Milankovic sat down and did something that still seems almost heroic in its patience. Working largely by hand with no computer to assist him, he spent years calculating the slow, subtle wobbles in the Earth's motion through space, and working out mathematically how those wobbles ought to change the amount of sunlight reaching different parts of the planet across tens of thousands of years. What he predicted, and what ice cores and ocean sediment cores have since confirmed with remarkable precision, is that the great ice ages of the past march to an astronomical rhythm made up of 3 overlapping cycles. The first is precession, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis, similar to the way a spinning top gradually traces a lazy circle as it loses momentum, completing roughly one full circuit every 26,000 years. The second is obliquity, the tilt of the axis itself, which gently nods between about 22 and 24 degrees over a cycle, lasting roughly 41,000 years, subtly strengthening or softening the difference between the seasons. And the third is eccentricity, the shape of the Earth's orbit around the Sun, which stretches gradually from nearly circular to a slightly elongated oval and back again over a period of roughly 100,000 years. None of these are theoretical. They are about as close to a fully proven planetary clock as science has ever produced, visible clearly in the geological record of ice ages stretching back hundreds of years. And here is the honest problem worth sitting with, because it cuts directly against the premise this whole night has been quietly circling. Look closely at those 3 numbers: 26,000 years, 41,000 years, 100,000 years. Not one of them is 12,000. There is no clean established astronomical cycle of that length hiding anywhere in the orbital mathematics. If someone tells you the heavens themselves are set on a strict 12,000-year timer, the actual data very politely, very firmly disagrees. It would be tempting to stop right there and conclude the whole 12,000-year pattern is simply an illusion, a trick of pattern-hungry minds working on far too little real information. But that would leave out something equally real, because the large, slow Milankovitch cycles are not the only rhythms the Earth and the Sun keep. There are faster, rougher pulses layered on top of them, considerably less tidy but no less genuine. Consider the Sun itself, which is not the steady, unchanging lamp. It appears to be from here. It has moods, long, quiet stretches followed by periods of intense activity, and every so often it falls into what astronomers call a grand minimum, a period lasting decades during which sunspot activity drops dramatically. The best documented example is known as the Maunder minimum, a stretch running from roughly 1645 to 1715, during which sunspots very nearly vanished from the surface of the Sun for close to 70 years. This period lines up strikingly with some of the coldest years of what historians call the Little Ice Age. A time of frozen rivers across Europe, repeatedly failed harvests, and famously frost fairs held directly on the frozen surface of the River Thames in London. It's worth being fair to the science here, because researchers do not believe a quiet sun alone caused that entire cold period. A cluster of major volcanic eruptions during roughly the same centuries almost certainly played the larger role in cooling the climate. But a subdued sun very likely deepened and extended the cold that was already underway. And the Maunder minimum was not a strange one-time fluke either. Reading further back through the Sun's history preserved in the chemical signature of old wood and old ice, researchers have identified other extended quiet periods scattered across the centuries, each with its own modest cooling effect, which is the genuinely unsettling part for anyone hoping for tidiness. These grand minima are entirely real, and they do recur, but they do not follow any predictable schedule you could circle on a calendar in advance. They arrive, they end, sometimes clustering closely together, sometimes staying away for centuries, and even now watching the sun as closely as modern instruments allow. Scientists cannot reliably forecast when the next one will begin. There is one more rhythm worth mentioning, quieter, still running through the Earth rather than the sky above it. The planet's magnetic field, the invisible shield that deflects the harshest of the solar wind and helps keep the atmosphere from slowly being stripped away into space, is often imagined as fixed and unchanging, always pointing reliably north. It isn't. It wanders continuously, it weakens and strengthens over time, and occasionally it does something considerably more dramatic. Around 41,000 years ago, in an event geologists call the Lachamp excursion, the field very nearly collapsed entirely for a geologically brief window, its strength dropping to a small fraction of normal, with the magnetic poles staggering and briefly attempting to flip before settling back into their familiar positions. During that window, considerably more cosmic radiation would have reached the ground than usual, and the increased radiation left its own chemical fingerprint in ancient ice and old trees, which is in fact part of how scientists are able to date the event with such precision today. It did not end the world. Human populations at the time lived through it without any apparent catastrophe. But it stands as a sober reminder that even the planet's own protective shield is capable of flickering briefly on a timescale considerably longer than any single human life it could ever... Radically. Taken all together, what emerges is neither the tidy, frightening clock the premise of tonight seemed to promise, nor complete silence either. What emerges instead is something quieter, and I think considerably more interesting. Several separate rhythms, moving at entirely different speeds, none of them lined up with one another, each one humming along on its own independent schedule, mostly out of step with all the rest. And it may be that this very lack of alignment, this scattered, uncoordinated overlapping of unrelated cycles, holds a more honest answer than any single 12,000-year bell ever could. There is a particular kind of question worth sitting with for a moment, one most people never think to ask, because the answer seems so obvious it hardly feels like a question at all. When a great civilization falls, is it always something falling upon it from outside, a drought, an invading army, a shift in the climate, or is it sometimes something closer to a choice made quietly by thousands of ordinary people, none of whom ever meant to bring an empire down at all? In 1988, an American anthropologist named Joseph Tainter published a book called The Collapse of Complex Societies, and it remains decades later one of the most quietly unsettling explanations anyone has offered for why civilizations end. Tainter wasn't interested in explaining just one collapse. He wanted a single underlying mechanism that could account for dozens of them at once. The fall of Rome, the disappearance of the lowland Maya cities, the abandonment of the great pueblos of the American Southwest cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, all following in his reading a strikingly similar pattern underneath their very different surface details. His argument begins somewhere unexpected, not with disaster but with problem solving. Every society he observed is essentially a machine for solving problems. A drought arises and the society responds by building irrigation canals and appointing officials to manage them. An enemy threatens the border and the society responds by raising a standing army and building fortifications. A population grows too large for its existing administration to manage, and the society responds by adding new layers of bureaucracy, new record keepers, new laws, new taxes to fund, all of it. Each of these responses adds complexity, and in the beginning that complexity is an extraordinary bargain. The first road built between two cities returns enormous benefit for a relatively modest cost. The first professional army is vastly more effective than an untrained militia. The earliest written laws prevent countless small disputes from spiraling into violence. Complexity in its early stages is one of the best investments a society can possibly make. But complexity, Tainter argued, obeys something close to a law of diminishing returns, the same principle an economist might recognize from almost any other context. The 10th administrator added to a growing bureaucracy solves less than the first one did because the easiest, most obvious problems were already solved by the earlier additions. The 100th mile of road matters less than the first mile, because the first mile likely connected two places that desperately needed connecting, while the 100th mile increasingly serves smaller and smaller benefits. And yet the cost of maintaining all of it, every road, every administrator, every soldier, every irrigation canal, keeps climbing steadily because someone still has to feed these people, house them, and pay them regardless of how much value their labor is actually still returning to the wider society. Eventually, a society can reach a point most of its own citizens never consciously notice arriving, a point where the total cost of maintaining its own complexity begins to exceed what that complexity is actually giving back. Here is where Tainter's idea becomes genuinely startling, and it is worth being honest that this remains one of the more debated parts of his framework among historians and archaeologists who continue to argue over how well it applies to any specific collapse compared to how well it works as a broad theoretical model. Tainter suggested that once this tipping point is reached, collapse can become, from the perspective of ordinary people living through it, something close to a rational choice. Not a catastrophe imposed helplessly from outside, but a kind of quiet economizing a society gradually shedding a level of complexity it genuinely can no longer afford. People stop paying taxes to a distant capital that provides diminishing services in return. They stop maintaining a road that connects them to a market that no longer benefits them the way it once did. They walk away from an overtaxed, overextended city and return to a simpler village life that for them specifically actually returns more value than the grand complicated system they're leaving behind ever did. There is a genuinely surprising detail from the later Roman world that fits this idea with an almost eerie precision, one that rarely makes it into popular retellings of Rome's fall. In some of the empire's more remote frontier provinces during its final difficult centuries, historical and archaeological evidence suggests that certain local populations found the arrangement offered by encroaching Germanic groups genuinely preferable to continued Roman rule, not because those groups were gentler or more generous, but because their demands were often simply smaller and more immediate. Rome by this point was asking for heavy taxation, military conscription, and unwavering loyalty to a distant, increasingly abstract emperor who provided noticeably less in return with each passing decade as the empire's own administrative costs spiraled upward. A local strongman, by comparison, asked for less and was near enough to actually deliver on whatever he did promise. It's important to be careful with this evidence because historians continue to debate exactly how widespread this sentiment really was, and how much of it reflects genuine popular preference versus simple practical accommodation to circumstances. Nobody had much control over either way. But the pattern itself, quiet, incremental, almost invisible from any single year to the next, appears again and again in the archaeological and historical record. Not a single dramatic battle lost, but 1,000 small ordinary decisions made independently by people who never met each other, each one choosing in their own small corner of a vast empire to simply stop holding up their piece of something that had grown too expensive to keep carrying. Seen this way, collapse looks considerably less like the sudden dramatic catastrophe most people picture and considerably more like a slow economic tide quietly going out. The very complexity that once made a civilization powerful becomes eventually the weight that pulls it under, and the people living through it are not passive victims of some external force so much as participants, each one making a small sensible decision in their own immediate self-interest, none of them intending, and few of them even realizing that their combined choices were slowly dismantling something enormous. Does that mean the drought, the earthquakes, and the desperate migrations we walked through earlier in this story didn't actually matter to what happened to the Bronze Age world? Not at all. And this is exactly where Tainter's framework and everything we've already covered together fit neatly against one another, two views of the very same underlying truth. A society that has kept itself simple and flexible can absorb a genuinely bad drought and largely survive it intact, bending under the strain without breaking. But a society already stretched taut by its own accumulated complexity, already paying more every single year for steadily diminishing returns, has no slack left in reserve when real trouble eventually arrives, and trouble sooner or later always arrives for everyone. The drought that a simpler, more resilient people might have weathered becomes, for the overextended and brittle civilization, the final weight that breaks something already close to breaking on its own. The external shock rarely has to grow larger. The society simply has to become more fragile by the time that shock finally shows up at its door. And underneath all of it sits the same idea that has been quietly threading through this entire night, appearing now in an entirely new and more troubling light. Every layer of specialization a society adds, every new expert trained to do one narrow task exceptionally well, is also by definition one more person who has traded away the broader, more general knowledge that might have let them survive independently if the system around them ever failed. The blacksmith still cannot grow his own food. The tax collector still cannot defend a wall, and the more sophisticated and interconnected a civilization becomes, the more true that becomes for nearly everyone living inside it all at once together. Which raises a question worth turning over slowly without any urgency at all as you drift a little further towards sleep. If Tainter is right, that complexity itself eventually becomes the very weight that brings a civilization down. What does that suggest about a world built on more specialization, more interdependence, and more invisible distant connections than any civilization in the whole of human history has ever attempted? Before a world, in fact, rather a lot like the one quietly humming along outside your window tonight. Take a slow walk in your mind through the sleeping house of the modern world, the way you might check that the doors are locked before finally settling in for the night. Not to frighten yourself, just to see clearly, calmly exactly what it is that holds everything up while you rest. Most of what keeps your ordinary evening running is something you have almost certainly never once had to think about, and that invisibility is really the whole point of it. A well-built system is one you never notice at all. You flip a switch and there is light. You turn a tap and clean water arrives. You order something small and unremarkable, and within a day or two it appears at your door, grown or manufactured on a continent you will likely never visit, carried across oceans by ships and trucks and hands you will never see or think about. It is a kind of everyday magic so complete and so reliable that it has stopped registering as magic at all. And underneath it runs a set of systems so tightly linked to one another that they behave less like a collection of separate tools and more like one enormous organism quietly humming through the night. Consider what actually has to be true for your evening to unfold exactly the way it does. The electrical grid has to remain balanced, moment-to-moment supply, matched precisely to demand across an entire region or continent, a feat of continuous coordination so delicate the engineers who manage it sometimes describe it in almost the same terms you'd use to describe a living heartbeat. The global supply chain has to keep turning, built around a principle known in the industry as just-in-time delivery. A phrase that is, once you understand it properly, both a genuine marvel of efficiency and quietly unsettling in equal measure. Modern industry largely stopped keeping large physical stockpiles of anything decades ago because storing a mountain of spare parts costs money, that could otherwise be put to more immediate use. So instead, factories and shops receive precisely what they need, precisely when they need it, with almost nothing held in reserve behind it, which means the shelves in an ordinary shop often carry only a few days' worth of stock at any given time, and many essential medicines are manufactured using ingredients that travel through several different countries before reaching the patient who finally needs them timed to arrive exactly when required and not meaningfully before. And above all of it, entirely unseen, runs a layer. Most people never think to look up at a network of satellites circling silently overhead. The system most people know casually as the little blue dot on a foam map does something considerably stranger and more essential underneath that simple surface. It functions as something close to the master clock of the modern world, and the precision timing signals it broadcasts are quietly relied upon by financial markets, by portions of the electrical grid, and by the exact timestamps that allow otherwise unrelated computer systems around the world to agree on what happened and in what order. Far beneath the ocean's surface, meanwhile, entirely out of sight run the cables. Not satellites, but physical cables, bundles of glass fibre, not much thicker than a garden hose, lying quietly along the seafloor, carrying nearly all of the world's internet traffic between continents. The messages, the financial transactions, the data underlying nearly everything threaded through a surprisingly small number of physical cables resting on the dark floor of the ocean. Here is the quiet vulnerability sitting underneath all of that, and it's worth naming plainly because it isn't a threat so much as simply an honest description of how the whole structure is shaped. Engineers have a specific term for it, a single point of failure, a place where an enormous amount of dependent activity can be disrupted by the loss of one relatively small specific thing. A modest number of undersea cables carry a genuinely startling share of intercontinental communication. A limited number of enormous custom-built electrical transformers machines, roughly the size of a small house, keep major portions of the grid functioning, and these specific transformers can take a year or considerably longer to manufacture and replace, and are not the kind of item any utility keeps sitting in a spare warehouse somewhere. A handful of narrow shipping canals and straits carry a remarkable percentage of the world's physical trade, narrow enough that a single large vessel turned sideways at exactly the wrong moment, as actually happened in the Suez Canal in 2021, can measurably slow global commerce for days. It's worth being precise about that particular event, since it's often remembered with more drama than the underlying reality strictly requires. The blockage lasted less than a week, and normal traffic resumed relatively quickly once the vessel was freed. But even that brief, contained disruption was enough to delay an estimated $9 billion of trade for every single day the canal remained blocked, a genuinely striking illustration of how much weight a single narrow point in an otherwise vast interconnected system can actually carry. There is an older event, though, that offers perhaps the clearest possible window into a different kind of vulnerability, entirely one connected to the sky rather than the sea. In the late summer of 1859, the sun released an enormous cloud of charged particles directly toward Earth. An English astronomer named Richard Carrington happened to be observing the sun through his telescope at the exact moment the initial flare occurred, which is the reason his name is still attached to the event more than a century and a half later. What followed remains even now the most intense geomagnetic storm ever properly recorded. The aurora, normally visible only in far northern or southern latitudes, blazed so far toward the equator that people as far south as the Caribbean reported seeing it clearly in the night sky. In some locations, witnesses described the sky glowing brightly enough to read a newspaper by well after midnight. Birds reportedly woke and began singing, apparently mistaking the unnatural light for the approach of dawn. And the telegraph system, essentially the only significant piece of long-distance electrical technology humanity possessed at that point in history, went into chaos. Sparks leapt visibly from telegraph equipment in stations across multiple continents. Some operators reported receiving genuine electric shocks from their own machines. Certain telegraph lines failed completely, while other lines strangely kept functioning even after operators had deliberately disconnected their batteries running, instead on the powerful electrical current. The storm itself was pushing directly through the wire. Wires. In 1859, this was a genuine curiosity, a strange and by most accounts a rather beautiful night, because there was almost nothing electrical around at the time capable of being seriously damaged by it. It's worth being honest that scientists still actively debate exactly how a storm of comparable intensity would play out across the considerably more complex electrical infrastructure of the modern world, since nothing on quite that scale has occurred again since detailed electrical monitoring became possible. But the general concern among specialists in this field is not really about whether a storm of similar strength will eventually occur again. The Sun has clearly done this before within recorded history, and by every reasonable measure available to researchers, it will very likely do something similar again at some point, though nobody can say with any real precision when that might be. The genuine uncertainty lies almost entirely in how well modern infrastructure, considerably more advanced, but also considerably more electrically dependent than anything that existed in 1859, would actually hold up against it. And if you sit with that question for a while, turning it over slowly rather than anxiously, you start to notice something rather striking about the shape of it. A modern collapse, if one were ever to genuinely begin, likely wouldn't look anything at all like the dramatic cinematic version so many films have trained us to expect. There would be no single explosive night, no dramatic horde gathering visibly at any border. It would look instead like the slow, quiet failure of countless small things almost nobody had ever consciously thought about before the transformer. Nobody knew existed, the cable resting quietly on a seafloor. Nobody had ever pictured the delivery that for the very first time in living memory simply doesn't arrive on schedule and then doesn't arrive again the following day either. Which is in its own way a shape we've already spent considerable time with tonight, walking slowly through the ruins of a much older, much smaller world a very long time ago. Let's finally lay everything we've gathered tonight out together quietly, the way you might spread a handful of old coins across a table before turning in just to look at them clearly one at a time in no particular hurry. The last true planetary reset, the one that ended 1,000-year winter and opened the long gentle window in which every field of grain, every city, every written word, humanity has ever produced, eventually took root happened roughly 12,000 years ago. The last time a genuinely interconnected civilization came apart entirely, and in the case of Mycenaean Greece, quite literally forgot how to write happened roughly 3,200 years ago. And the deep rhythms we went looking for across the sky and the earth turned out to be entirely real. The torrid stream genuinely exists, and the earth genuinely crosses it twice. Every year as the Milankovitch cycles genuinely pace the rise and fall of the ice ages, the sun genuinely does fall quiet for decades at a stretch, and the planet's magnetic field genuinely does wander and weaken over time. None of that was invented for the sake of a good story. It's sitting there in the ice cores and the ocean sediment and the careful mathematics of orbits available to anyone patient enough to go looking for it. So when someone tells you humanity is overdue for something, it's worth understanding exactly where that feeling comes from, because it isn't coming from nowhere. It has real numbers standing behind it. And yet there is a quiet trap folded into that particular word, one easy to walk straight past without ever noticing it's there. The word overdue only really means anything if something somewhere is actually keeping time. Think about how you use that word in your own life. A bus is overdue because a schedule exists and the schedule tells you when it should have already arrived. But imagine instead that you're flipping an ordinary coin and it happens to land on heads 9 times in a row. Something in your gut starts to insist the next flip simply has to come up tails. It feels overdue, and it isn't not even slightly. The coin has no memory of what it did a moment ago. It landed on heads 9 times, and the next flip remains exactly as even as it always was. That particular feeling, the conviction that a streak simply must correct itself, soon has a name among statisticians, the gambler's fallacy, and it has quietly emptied a great many wallets in casinos for exactly this reason. Which brings us to the honestly uncomfortable centre of the whole question we've been circling all night. If the great catastrophes of deep time are essentially random in their timing, arriving whenever they happen to arrive with no underlying clock actually keeping count, then the simple fact that 12,000 quiet years have now passed tells us precisely nothing meaningful about tonight specifically. The universe is not maintaining a running tally anywhere. It has no awareness that we exist, let alone any sense that we might be due for something. Those 12,000 years can feel emotionally like pressure building steadily toward release in exactly the same way 9 heads in a row can feel like pressure building towards tails. But the coin has no memory, and there is no strong scientific reason to believe the sky keeps one either. Before setting the word aside entirely, though it deserves one honest exception because there is a version of overdue that genuinely holds up, even if it isn't quite the dramatic version that tends to make for an alarming headline. Rare events, even genuinely random ones with no fixed schedule at all, become steadily more likely the longer you wait for them, simply as a matter of accumulating probability over time. If something carries even a small chance of occurring in any given year, then stretched out across enough centuries that small yearly chance gradually shifts from unlikely toward likely and eventually towards something close to inevitable, though never on any specific date you could reasonably circle on a calendar in advance. And the reassuring flip side of that same principle is worth sitting with for a moment too, because it means the last 12,000 years have not actually been climatically ordinary at all. They have been remarkably, almost probably calm. The entire Holocene, this long, warm, gentle stretch in which every city was built and every book was written and every quiet, ordinary night's sleep in recorded history took place, has been an unusually generous span of weather by the planet's own long-standing standards. Nobody living through it earned that calm through any particular effort. We simply happen to be born inside it. So what honestly is genuinely likely to happen someday, understanding clearly that someday very rarely means anytime soon? A geomagnetic storm on the scale of the one recorded in 1859 is, by most careful estimates from solar physicists, a matter of when, rather than if considered across a timescale of centuries rather than years. A sizable impact from space, a rock large enough to genuinely matter, becomes close to certain across a sufficiently long stretch of deep time, though the actual odds in any single year remain remarkably reassuringly small, small enough that a person is considerably more likely to live an entire ordinary life without ever witnessing one. A major volcanic super-eruption, the kind capable of dimming skies across an entire hemisphere for a season or more, has happened before in the planet's history, and will very likely happen again eventually on a timescale measured in tens of thousands of years. And a magnetic excursion of the Earth's own field, similar to the one recorded at La Chaume roughly 41,000 years ago, is simply part of how this planet's interior behaves over sufficiently long stretches of time. Notice, though, what every one of those genuinely real possibilities shares in common. Each one carries a small honest chance within any particular year, and a considerably larger chance across a very long span of centuries. and not one of them runs on anything resembling a shared 12,000-year schedule. They are each of them separate slow dice rolling independently at entirely different speeds, mostly out of sync with one another, only occasionally landing on something unfavourable within the same rough century purely by coincidence. And when that happens, when several of these slow independent processes happen to land badly within roughly the same narrow window of time that is very likely closer to what a genuine reset actually looks like from the inside, not one single dramatic clock striking midnight on cue, but several unrelated rhythms briefly unluckily agreeing with each other at once, which leads gently to something that has never once been true for any civilization that came before this one. A genuinely new development sitting quietly at the very center of this entire story, one worth carrying carefully into whatever comes next tonight. Every single person who lived through every collapse we've walked through together tonight shared one thing in common. Something so basic it's easy to overlook entirely. None of them saw it coming, not one. The farmers of the late Bronze Age had no way of knowing their difficult harvest would stretch into a difficult century. The hunters watching the world plunge back into ice at the start of the Younger. Dryas had no framework at all for understanding why the warmth they remembered from childhood simply wasn't returning. Every culture that has ever come apart in the whole span of recorded and unrecorded history walked into its own ending, essentially blind, with no instruments capable of measuring the danger, no way of separating an ordinary bad year from the opening chapter of something considerably larger. That blindness wasn't a failure of intelligence or courage. It was simply the normal condition of being human for every single generation right up until very recently. We are in one very specific and rather remarkable sense the first generation in the entire history of this species that isn't blind in quite the same way. Right now, while you rest, there are people and instruments quietly watching the sky on behalf of everyone else. Astronomers have mapped the orbits of tens of thousands of asteroids, tracking their paths years and in many cases decades into the future. And for the genuinely large ones, the kind capable of causing serious regional or global harm, that catalogue is about as thorough as current technology allows, and it shows nothing of real concern heading our way in the foreseeable future. Solar observatories keep a continuous watch on the sun every hour of every day, so that when it does eventually throw one of its larger tantrums, there is at least some warning, typically somewhere between several hours and a couple of days. Enough time to take meaningful precautions with sensitive electrical infrastructure and orbiting satellites. Spacecraft have even been sent out to study the torrid debris stream directly and the comet Encke that sits at its center, gathering exactly the kind of detailed data that might eventually help settle one way or another some of the open questions we spent time with earlier tonight. It's worth being honest, though, that this watchfulness has real limits, and pretending otherwise wouldn't serve you well at 3 a.m. Our ability to track large asteroids is genuinely strong for objects of a certain size, but considerably weaker for smaller objects still large enough to cause serious regional damage. The kind closer in scale to the object that exploded over Chelyabinsk in Russia in 2013, which arrived with essentially no advance warning at all, injuring around 1,500 people through broken glass and structural damage almost entirely from the shockwave of an object that had approached from a direction ground-based telescopes simply weren't positioned to see coming. Our ability to forecast a major solar storm days in advance is real, but our ability to predict its precise strength and exact trajectory even hours before it arrives remains considerably more limited than most people assume. This is not a small caveat, and it deserves to be said plainly rather than glossed over for the sake of a tidier ending. Watching carefully is not the same thing as being fully protected, and it would be its own kind of dishonesty to suggest otherwise. And yet even with those honest limits fully acknowledged, something has genuinely and permanently changed about the shape of this old recurring story. The people of the Bronze Age had no observatory anywhere on Earth capable of studying the drought slowly settling over their world. The hunters who watched the ice return at the start of the Younger Dryas had no possible way of understanding what a stalled ocean current even was, let alone one capable of measuring it. Every person who has ever lived through one of these older resets did so without ever fully understanding what had actually come for them, or why. We are the first generation permitted to look up and at least partially understand what we're actually looking at. That doesn't make any of this fully predictable, and it certainly doesn't make it impossible. But it does make us awake in a way genuinely no generation before us ever quite managed to be, and there is something worth holding on to in that something almost tender, once you sit with it for a while in the quiet. Which leaves gently one last thing worth carrying with you, as this long night finally begins to settle toward its close. Something considerably warmer than watchfulness alone, because watching the sky was never really the whole of what carried humanity through its darkest chapters before. What carried people through the darkest of these old chapters was never really watchfulness at all. It was something smaller, and it survives in the record in the quietest possible ways if you know where to look for it. There is a detail from Göbekli Tepe worth returning to now, one we touched on earlier but didn't fully sit with. When archaeologists eventually reached the bottom of those buried enclosures beneath the deliberate fill of rubble and earth and old animal bone, they found something almost startling in its ordinariness. Wild einkorn wheat, one of the earliest ancestors of the grain that would eventually feed the whole of civilization, growing in the hills surrounding that very site. Genetic studies of modern domesticated wheat trace a significant portion of its origin to this exact region of southeastern Turkey within a short distance of that buried monument. Which means the people who gathered on that hill to raise pillars taller than themselves, carved with foxes and vultures and serpents, were standing, quite possibly without knowing it, in one of the very places where humanity first began the long, patient work of turning a wild grass into a harvest. The temple and the first field may have shared the same small patch of earth, not because anyone planned it that way, but because that is simply what people do, gathering in one place for one reason and slowly without ceremony building the next chapter of the world around them almost by accident. That is the thread worth holding on to, now more than any date, more than any comet, more than any argument still unresolved among careful scientists. Every ending we have walked through together tonight, the drought that hollowed out a connected Bronze Age world, the winter that returned without warning and stayed for 1,000 years, was also quietly somewhere a beginning. The scribe in Ugarit never sent his letter, and his city burned before a morning, but barely a few centuries later, that same alphabet-based system of writing, reshaped and carried forward by Phoenician traders along those same old shipping routes, would become the ancestor of nearly every alphabet used across the modern world, including the very letters forming the words you are hearing now. Loss was real. It was not undone, but it was not the last word either. This has never really been a story about fear, even though fear is where a story like this one so easily could have gone. It has been a story about the strange, steady persistence of people who kept going without ever knowing whether their world would still exist by morning, the same way you don't know it either, the same way no one in any age ever really has. The people of Ugarit did not know. The Clovis hunters watching the ice return did not know. And you resting here tonight do not know precisely what tomorrow holds either. None of us ever have. That has always been the quiet, unspoken condition of being alive in any century at all. And somehow every single time across every one of these long dark stretches, someone was left to plant the next season's grain, to teach a child how to find water, to carve a bird into a piece of stone simply because it felt like something worth doing. So let the numbers go now. Let the dates and the comets and the careful arguments between scientists settle quietly into the back of your mind the way sediment settles at the bottom of still water. They were never really the point. The point was always the people, the scribe who kept writing anyway, the hunters who gathered on a hillside and built something beautiful out of stone right at the edge of the worst winter their world had ever known. The countless generations who carried a story about a flood mouth to ear for longer than anyone could count, simply so it would not be forgotten. You are one more link in that same long unbroken chain tonight. Nothing is required of you right now except rest. The world does not need you to solve anything tonight. It only needs you to sleep the way every person before you eventually did, trusting the way they trusted that morning would come again. It always has. Somewhere outside right now, the same old sky is turning quietly overhead. The way it turned over Ugarit, the way it turned over that hill in Anatolia. Patient, indifferent, and strangely beautiful. And under it you are safe. You are warm. You are held. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts go quiet one by one like lights going out across a sleeping city. There is nothing left to carry tonight. Only this. A warm bed, a turning world, and the soft, certain knowledge that somehow against everything the story always finds someone left to carry it forward. Sleep now.